Julian stared at the landline phone. It sat on the polished mahogany desk in his father's study, an anachronistic relic in a house otherwise updated with smart technology. It was heavy avocado green plastic from the late 80s, the kind of machine that demanded permanence in a world of ephemera. His father, Arthur Vance, had died 6 weeks ago. A sudden, massive heart attack while reading the morning paper. No illness, no warning, just a full stop at 68. The loss had been a physical rupture for Julian, 28, who had always viewed his reserved, stoic father as an immutable fixture, a quiet pillar supporting their stable, predictable life in Greenwich, Connecticut. Julian's younger sister, Lena, was handling the digital assets. Julian was tasked with the physical clearing. The books, the papers, the heavy silence of the study. He hated it. Every drawer held a ghost. "Seriously, Jules? Who even uses a landline anymore?" Lena's voice was tinny from the doorway, her phone glued to her ear. "We should just chuck it. It probably hasn't rung in a decade." Julian picked up the handset, the plastic warm from being handled. "Dad kept it for a reason, Lena. It was his anchor. Remember, he always said, if the power fails, the landline connects you to the world." He placed the phone back down and ran his fingers along the base. He noticed a slight resistance when he tried to lift the receiver cradle. He pulled harder, and the cradle came away, revealing a small, yellowed piece of notepad paper tucked beneath the coiled cord. The paper was brittle, the ink faded but legible. It contained a single 7-digit phone number, bracketed by a strict instruction written in Arthur's elegant, precise handwriting. "Only if everything is lost. 917. 554XXX." Julian's breath hitched. His father had been a man of immense control. He filed his taxes in triplicate, labeled every wire in the house, and planned their annual family vacation down to the minute. He did not leave cryptic, dramatic notes unless they were of paramount importance. "What is it?" Lena asked, finally lowering her phone, sensing the shift in the air. Julian showed her the note. "A phone number, and a warning." "A burner line? What, was Dad running some kind of secret financial network?" Lena joked, but her eyes were wide. The 917 area code was Manhattan. Their father worked in insurance, solid, boring insurance. He wrote, "Only if everything is lost," Julian murmured, pocketing the note. "Well, everything is lost now, isn't it?" Lena looked genuinely troubled. "Jules, maybe it's just an old contact, someone he lost touch with. Let it go. We have enough to deal with." But Julian couldn't. The note was a breach in his father's perfectly constructed wall. It hinted at a complexity, a vulnerability Arthur had never allowed them to see. It was the loose thread he was compelled to pull. That evening, back in his own silent apartment, Julian poured himself a scotch, let the ice settle, and pulled out the old paper. The scotch was for courage, the silence for focus. He didn't use the dusty old landline. He used his cell phone, his heart hammering against his ribs as he input the digits. It rang twice, a clean, sharp sound, before it was answered. "Hello? This is Eliza." The voice was not what Julian expected. It was warm, musical, and carried an undeniable gravitas. It sounded like the voice of a woman who was used to giving orders, but with kindness. Not a mistress, not a shady contact. A professional. Julian cleared his throat. "Hello. I apologize for calling this number, but I found it among my father's effects. Arthur Vance." There was a sudden, absolute silence on the line, heavier than any physical distance. "Arthur?" The voice, Eliza, whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a realization, laced with an unimaginable pain. "Oh God, Arthur! Did something happen?" The simple, unvarnished fear in her voice was Julian's first real shock. This was not a forgotten friend. "I'm afraid so," Julian said gently. "He passed away 6 weeks ago. Suddenly." On the other end, he heard a sharp intake of breath, a sound that bordered on a muffled sob. "6 weeks? And you're calling now?" Eliza's voice was now rough, accusatory. "Why now? Why wait? I just found this number today." He labeled it very cryptically. "I didn't even know you existed," Julian confessed. "Who are you?" She took a long, shaky breath, regaining control. "I'm Dr. Eliza Allison. I'm a cardiologist in San Francisco, and Arthur Vance was the love of my life. Julian felt a dizzying coldness spread through his chest. The love of my life. His mother, Evelyn, had been his father's wife for 35 years. Their life was a monument to stability. I don't understand, Julian stammered. He was married to my mother, Evelyn. Yes. The arrangement, Eliza said, her voice dropping, thick with old wounds. I know about Evelyn. We both made sacrifices for Arthur's life in Connecticut. We both knew the truth of his obligations. Julian sat down hard on the edge of his bed. Obligations? What truth? My parents loved each other. They had respect, Julian. They had commitment. But not the passion he and I shared. Not the life he wanted to live. Her voice broke slightly. Arthur and I were together, truly together, for 30 years. He flew out here every month. We spent holidays together when he could manage it. We lived a parallel existence. Julian gripped the phone, his world tilting. He thought about his father's endless business trips, the quiet solitude of his life. It suddenly made a horrific kind of sense. Then Eliza spoke again, and this time, the words were a catastrophic, life-altering blow. I'm so sorry, Julian. If you're his son, then you need to know this. I loved your father, and he was the one who insisted on the phone number. He said I had to know if he was gone. But you also need to know about our son, Ethan, your father's other son. Julian couldn't form words. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to rewind the last minute. Our son. Other son. Ethan is 28, Julian. He was born the same year as you. Arthur was with us both. He was a father in 2 cities, 2 time zones, 2 completely different worlds. A cold, visceral understanding hit Julian. He was 28. March 15th, 1997. When is Ethan's birthday? Julian whispered. Eliza answered without hesitation. March 15th, 1997. They were born on the same day. He always said you were both his impossible sons. Julian dropped the phone. The plastic cracked against the wood floor. He and his twin brother, separated at birth, raised 3,000 miles apart, tethered by one secretive, complicated man. His entire identity, his stable, predictable life, had been built on a foundation of lies and a 3-decade-long arrangement. Part 2. The Quiet Confrontation. The next morning, the confrontation with his mother, Evelyn, was inevitable. Julian found her in the sunroom, meticulously cataloging Arthur's first edition books. Evelyn was a woman of elegant composure, her gray hair always perfectly coiffed, her expression always serene. Julian placed the cracked phone on the table. I called the number I found under the landline. Evelyn stopped sorting, her hand freezing over a volume of Emerson. She didn't look up immediately. The silence stretched, thick and painful. It was Dr. Eliza Allison, Julian continued, his voice tight with controlled anger. Arthur's love for 30 years. The woman he wanted to marry. The mother of my twin brother, Ethan. Evelyn finally looked up. Her eyes were not surprised, nor were they tearful. They were simply tired. She called him Arthur, Evelyn corrected gently. I always called him Van. Arthur Vance. The man who was obligated to this name, this house, this social standing. Obligated? Julian stared at her, utterly confused. You sound like you knew. Evelyn sighed, closing the book. Sit down, Julian. This is not the story of a villain and a victim. It's the story of compromise and 2 broken contracts. She began to explain their history. Arthur's family was old Connecticut money. Not rich, but established. Evelyn's family was facing financial ruin. The marriage, 3.5 decades ago, had been a business transaction thinly veiled as romance. It saved both families' reputations and provided Arthur with the resources he needed to launch his career. Arthur and I had respect. We had ambition. We were good partners. But we never had fire, Evelyn said, her voice emotionless like reciting a contract. When he met Eliza at a conference in '93, she was just finishing her residency. He came home and told me he had found the great love of his life. He was ready to leave. Julian reeled. And you let him go? I couldn't. Not publicly. The scandal would have destroyed the family interests and my parents. We had signed papers, Julian. He couldn't dissolve the marriage without catastrophic financial and social cost. So what did you do? We struck a compromise. I told him, you fulfill your obligations here. You be the father, the husband in name, the public figure, and you can find happiness elsewhere. Just be discreet. I will never ask, and you will never tell. Evelyn's composure finally cracked. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. I traded my husband's heart for my family's stability. I loved him, Julian, but I loved him enough to know he would suffocate if I kept him entirely. I wanted him to have that passion, even if I couldn't be the recipient of it. She looked at Julian, the honesty raw and terrifying. When you and Lena were born, our impossible children, as he called you, it gave us a new bond. It cemented the facade. When he told me he had another son, Ethan, born the same day, I was devastated. But I was not surprised. I was glad for him. I knew the alternative was him leaving us entirely, and I couldn't bear that. Julian felt the rage drain out of him, replaced by a profound, agonizing pity for both his parents. His Ethan, the artist, asked Julian about the complex dynamics of the stock market, fascinated by the rules his father lived by in New York. The bond was instant, effortless, and almost frighteningly complete. They finished each other's sentences, laughed at the same obscure references, and shared the same slightly crooked pinky finger. On the last night, Julian called his mother. "Evelyn, I met him, Mom," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's amazing. He's exactly what Dad would have been if he hadn't married into the family. He's Dad, but happier." Evelyn was silent for a moment. "I knew it," she said softly. "Arthur deserved that version of himself." "Are you okay, Julian?" "I am. I understand now. Dad wasn't a hero or a villain. He was just human. He tried to love everyone who loved him, and he left us a way to become whole." Before Julian left for the airport, Ethan gave him a gift, a small, exquisitely detailed charcoal drawing. It was a single-line sketch of the old green landline phone, cracked and abandoned on the floor, but radiating a faint, complex light. "It's the pivot point," Ethan explained. "The small, simple machine that held the biggest secret." And it was his final word. His love letter to both of us. Julian returned to Connecticut with more than just a drawing. He returned with a profound, terrifying shift in perspective. He told Lena everything. Her reaction was shock, followed by laughter, followed by an immediate demand for a video call with her new twin brother. The integration was slow, cautious, and intensely real. Eliza flew to New York to meet Evelyn. The meeting was fraught with decades of unspoken grief, jealousy, and mutual respect. They didn't become friends, but they became allies. Two women who had shared the same man, now sharing the burden of his memory and the joy of his two sons. Julian eventually left his corporate job. The structures his father had built for him, the safety, the prestige, now felt suffocating. He decided to go back to school for urban planning, a field that allowed him to use his analytical skills to build spaces that brought people together, not separated them. Ethan started flying to New York regularly, staying in the Greenwich house with Julian and Evelyn. He discovered a side of his father that was rooted in quiet tradition and inherited duty, a side he had only glimpsed. 2 years later, the landline phone, now a symbol of connection rather than secrecy, sits on a shelf in Julian's new apartment. Next to it is Ethan's drawing. Julian and Ethan talk every single day. They are not two halves of a whole, but two separate, complete individuals who share an impossible beginning. Their father, Arthur, had spent his life divided, driven by obligation and love. In his death, he had managed to achieve what he could not in life. He had united his two worlds. And it all began with a simple, cryptic phone number waiting patiently for the moment everything was lost, so that everything could finally be found. Arthur wasn't a reckless cheat. He was a man who tried to honor two impossible contracts. His mother wasn't a naive wife. She was a quiet martyr who chose a gilded cage to protect her own. "He called you impossible sons?" Julian asked, his voice cracking. "Yes, because they were born into an impossible reality." He was determined to be a full father to both of you, in both cities, Evelyn explained. That's why he was always working, always traveling. He wasn't building an empire. He was building two lives. The complexity was suffocating. Julian realized the quiet, reserved man he knew was actually a logistical mastermind, constantly balancing flights, time zones, and identities, all to avoid hurting the people he loved, yet ultimately hurting everyone. And the phone number? Julian asked. His failsafe. His final contingency, Evelyn said, looking at the old green phone. If he died, and I didn't know how to reach Eliza, and she didn't know how to reach us, the secret could die with him. He made sure that, in the event of everything being lost, his two worlds would finally connect. Julian stood up, the chair scraping the polished floor. The anger was gone. Only action remained. I need to go to San Francisco, Julian said simply. I need to meet my brother. Evelyn nodded, her face returning to its characteristic stoicism. Of course. Go. And Julian, tell Ethan that his father never missed a birthday. Just sometimes, the call came a few hours later. Part 3. The Journey and the Other. Julian booked the flight for the following day. He didn't tell Lena. This was too fragile, too seismic to share yet. He spent the flight, 6 agonizing hours crossing a continent that felt like a chasm, staring at the city lights below, trying to reconcile the image of his father, the man who taught him to tie a Windsor knot, versus the man who was in love with a cardiologist 3,000 miles away. Dr. Eliza Allison met him at the airport. She was mid-50s, sharp, with kind eyes crinkled from decades of smiling, or perhaps worrying. She wore scrubs under a long coat, clearly having stepped away from a demanding day. "Julian," she said, her voice exactly as warm as it had sounded on the phone. She didn't hug him, but her handshake was firm and lingered. "You look so much like him." The same set to the jaw. "You look like the woman my father spent his whole life trying to get back to," Julian replied, without thinking. Eliza winced, but nodded. "He was with me last month. He was here for 3 days. We talked about retiring and finally being open. He never got the chance." They drove through the chaotic, vibrant streets of San Francisco. This city felt alien to Julian, too steep, too foggy, too alive. "Where are we going?" Julian asked. "Home. Ethan lives with me in the Presidio Heights apartment Arthur helped buy," she explained. "Ethan is waiting. I told him only that Arthur had a son from New York who needed to meet him. I didn't use the word twin. That's yours to say." They arrived at a beautiful, slightly older home overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge. The view was breathtaking, filled with the kind of light and air that Julian's father always seemed to seek during his business trips. This was Arthur's sanctuary. "Ethan is an artist," Eliza said as they stepped into the foyer. "He teaches art and works with veterans using trauma therapy through creative expression. He's very different from you, Julian. More expressive. More Arthur's heart." Julian's own job, investment banking analysis, felt suddenly hollow and cold. He was Arthur's duty. Ethan was Arthur's dream. He followed Eliza through a bright living room filled with colorful canvases and sculptures into the kitchen. And there he was. A man was sitting at the breakfast bar, drawing in a large sketchbook, a mug of tea beside him. He looked up when the door opened. Julian stopped dead. The resemblance was not just a passing similarity. It was a perfect, unnerving echo. Ethan had the same intense hazel eyes, the same precise curve of the nose, and the same dark, unruly hair Julian had to fight every morning. He was Julian's mirror image, but subtly softened by a different life. His posture looser, his clothes paint-splattered, his expression immediately open and questioning. "Ethan," Eliza said softly. "This is Julian Vance. He flew out from New York." Ethan stood up slowly. He was exactly Julian's height, exactly his build. They could have been wearing the same shirt. They were the same man, separated by the immense weight of the decisions made 28 years ago. "You look," Ethan began, his voice a slightly lower register than Julian's, carrying a hint of the West Coast casualness. He trailed off, visibly stunned. "You look exactly like me." Julian managed a tight, nervous laugh. I know. It's the worst icebreaker in history. He looked at Eliza, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. The time for truth was now. My father, Julian started, his voice thick. Arthur Vance. He was my father. He died 6 weeks ago. I found a note with Eliza's number, a number I was meant to call only if everything was lost. Ethan's brow furrowed. Arthur was my dad, the man who visited, the man who always seemed sad to leave. What does that have to do with you? Julian swallowed hard. Ethan, we were born on the same day, March 15th, 1997. My mother, Evelyn, was his wife in New York. Eliza was his partner here. I am Arthur's son, and I'm pretty sure I'm your twin brother. The statement hung in the air, immense and impossible. Ethan's face went white. He looked from Julian to his mother, who was now leaning against the counter, tears silently streaming down her face. Is that true, Mom? Ethan's voice was barely audible. Eliza nodded, the simple gesture confirming a lifetime of lies. He never wanted you to know about the other life, Ethan. He wanted to protect you both from the impossible reality he created. Part 4. 2 Impossible Sons. The next 48 hours were a blur of intense, uncomfortable, and utterly essential conversation. Julian stayed in the guest room, but most of the time was spent around the kitchen table, fueled by coffee and the desperate need for answers. Ethan was initially resentful, not of Julian, but of the immense, controlling secret. He taught me how to paint with light, Julian. He taught me to question authority. He was my hero, Ethan said, running a hand through his dark hair. But he was never fully here. Now I know why. He was always half gone, half focused on the other life. The real life in Connecticut. It wasn't the real life, Ethan. It was the gilded prison, Julian countered. My mother and father had an arrangement, a contract. He was legally trapped. The man you saw, the one who taught you to paint, that was the man he wanted to be. The man I knew, the reserved, always on a phone call executive. That was the man he had to be. They started comparing notes, finding terrifying, beautiful overlaps. Julian. He always called me at 5 p.m. on the dot on my birthday. Ethan. He always called me at 8 p.m. Pacific, right after the East Coast dinner. Julian. He taught me how to play chess on a beautiful mahogany board. Ethan. He taught me chess on a portable travel set we'd play on the beach. Same strategies, though. He hated the Queen's Gambit. The most striking realization came when Julian described the cryptic note and the landline. He was planning for this, Julian said, running a finger over the crack on the phone. The number was for a time when he couldn't keep both worlds spinning anymore. He wanted us to find each other. Ethan looked at him, his intense gaze mirroring Julian's own reflection. He spent his entire life managing the fallout of one impossible choice. He never chose one family over the other. He chose to live in 2 impossible halves. Eliza provided the missing pieces. Arthur had initially tried to make the family work by having one son in New York and one daughter in San Francisco. When both children turned out to be sons, born hours apart, Arthur saw it as a sign. He believed it was destiny, Eliza explained softly. 2 sons, same soul, same day, representing his 2 worlds. Julian, the legacy, the solidity. Ethan, the passion, the freedom. He couldn't choose, so he split himself to be whole. The emotional weight of this fractured fatherhood was immense. Julian realized that his father hadn't been reserved out of coldness, but out of absolute exhaustion. Every joke he told, every piece of advice he gave, had to be carefully weighed to ensure it wouldn't reveal the parallel life. He never stopped loving your mother, Evelyn, in his own way, Eliza told Julian. He respected her sacrifice. He told me she was his co-conspirator, his partner in this magnificent, terrible lie. Ethan, the artist, approached the crisis with a painter's perspective. We are 2 colors mixed from the same palette, Julian. I have his heart, and you have his structure. We are the 2 portraits of the same man. They went to the hospital where Ethan was born, the same hospital where Eliza worked. They stood outside the delivery wing, a silent acknowledgement of the single day that created 2 lifetimes. You know, Ethan said finally, looking at his brother, the weight of the moment settling into a quiet resolve. The resentment is still there. But it's not for you, or Mom, or your mother. It's for the world that forced him to choose money and obligation over pure love. And now that world is dead. It died with him. Part 5. A new kind of whole Julian extended his trip. He couldn't leave yet. He and Ethan spent the next few days not as long-lost twins, but as two strangers finding the map to a shared heritage. They hiked in Muir Woods, where Ethan revealed his art studio. Julian, the analyst, found himself looking at the light filtering through the redwoods with an artist's eye, just as his father might.